My name is Raphael Shushat, Dr. Raphael Shushat, and I would like to talk to you today about mystical paradigms and the quest to understand the human anima. And the subtitle is Theories of the Soul in Aristotle and Neo-Aristotelian Thinkers in the Middle Ages and the Mystical Paradigms of Spanish Kabbalah. All good science begins with the hypothesis, which in Greek refers to an underlying substratum, which becomes the base of the idea being built. Paradigms are such suppositions that lay the groundwork upon which one can build. Aristotle, in his De Anima, quotes the paradigms of Anaxagoras, Democritus, Plato, Diogenes, and others in his discussion on the human soul. Paradigms help to focus the discussion. They can be accepted or rejected either in their entirety or partially. The discussion of the soul and its functions is a discussion that lies on the border of observation and intuition. These discussions of Aristotle's De Anima were developed by thinkers in the Middle Ages like Al-Farabi, Averroes, Maimonides, and Aquinas, and prepared the early groundwork for the field of psychology, which began only in the 19th century. Even today, the study of psychology begins with the theories of personality over the century, which were the paradigms for understanding the human self. These theories were added to by modern psychologists such as William James, Freud, B.F. Skinner, Carl Jung, and others. Every model has its strength and its weaknesses. At the same time that Al-Farabi and Maimonides were commenting on Aristotle's model of the soul, the Kabbalah emerged in Provence and Girona. Since philosophy and mysticism were standing face to face in Spain, it forced the Kabbalists to use philosophical terminology in forming their paradigms of the soul. Mysticism, despite its claim to otherworldly revelations, is observed and studied by researchers as a human phenomenon. The mystics were extremely interested in understanding the human soul and the self. The models that they formulated, whether intuitive or through meditative experiences, are the way they created paradigms for understanding the soul. These paradigms can either be accepted or rejected, just like the early theories of personality, but need to be considered. It is my feeling that these paradigms can be useful tools as novel ways to understand the human soul. In my presentation, I will bring a few examples of how mystical models from Kabbalistic works in the Middle Ages can be used to both challenge some of the underlying concepts of our understanding of man, as well as serve as tools to aid in the understanding of the human psyche, its balances and imbalances. In this talk, I will focus on 3 of 5 examples of how this model interacts with the Aristotelian one, and at the same time offers alternative ways of seeing mankind. Why look to mysticism for a paradigm? Paradigms are important since they help direct thought and research, especially in the social sciences and in particular, psychology. Intuition plays a role in understanding experiences that cannot seem to be quantified in the laboratory. The early theories of personality were all such and were not necessarily based on empirical or scientific data. This is true not only of Plato in the Republic and Aristotle in the Anima or Hippocrates, but also of thinkers of the 19th and 20th century, such as Freud, Adler, or Jung. So why turn to the mystics? It depends on what we are discussing. If we were discussing chemistry, I would not suggest mysticism for a model. However, we are discussing the human psyche, particularly mind and consciousness, what some have referred to as the hard problems of cognitive science. There can be value in mystical descriptions of their ecstatic experiences and their understanding of the human soul and consciousness. Even if one disregards the religious and spiritual claims behind them, one can focus instead on the claims of these mystics of experiencing deep states of altered consciousness, of having traditions that describe deep states of human consciousness. This we can find among the Eastern yogis and the Muslim Sufis, and the Christian mystics and the Jewish Kabbalists. Since my personal field is the study of Kabbalah, it is here where I shall focus. 3 of the 5 examples. The 12th century was a time of great philosophical thinking in Spain. In the world of philosophy, where the mind can freely transcend borders, there began a borrowing of ideas. Muhammad al-Farabi and Avicenna, as well as Averroes, had a profound influence on Maimonides and Gersonides. And in turn, Maimonides had a profound influence on Thomas Aquinas. This was a time of the germination of new ideas. And it appears that the winds of war between the Christians in northern Spain and the Muslims in the south could not even stymie this influence. Simultaneously, in this period, we find the first works of Kabbalistic literature being written in Provence and then Spain, making their way afterwards to Italy, where they fascinated Jewish and Christian thinkers alike. Without going into complicated questions of the origins of Kabbalah, which goes well beyond the present discussion, it is interesting to note that despite certain influences that Greek philosophy had on its literary emergence, it contained novel ideas that were to change the way we see some of the basic human issues. I will offer a few examples. Number one, what is man? We tend to refer to human beings as Homo sapiens. This Latin word is steeped in early Greek thinking that the highest capacity of the human experience is thought, specifically logical thought. Therefore, mankind was connoted thinking man. For Aristotle, nature was founded upon a hierarchy. The lowest level was minerals, above that plants, which have the power of growth, above that animals, which have the power of movement, and above that man who possesses the power of speech, the logos. This power of speech is the expression of human reason, which is the defining aspect of man. Aristotle was unimpressed with human emotions and taught the virtue of apathy to one's affections. Like other neo-Aristotelians, Maimonides saw the faculty of reason as the defining characteristic of man. The idea of the intellect being the defining aspect of man was accepted by all Jewish and Muslim philosophers of the Middle Ages and even some of the mystics. Solomon ben Isaac, known as Rashi, in his commentary to Genesis, writes that where it says, and a man was a living being, Genesis 2:7, none of the animals were called by this term. However, man's soul was referred to as living due to his added ability of knowledge and speech. The Jewish rationalists, as did their non-Jewish philosophical contemporaries, even described the heavens above as possessing higher intellect. These were seen as being represented by the orbits of the planets circling the Earth, the lowest being the orbit of the moon around the Earth, which represented the active intellect, and above this, the higher intellects. God was the supreme intellect who knew all. This idea was possibly born through a crossbreeding of Neoplatonic and neo-Aristotelian thinking, and was a dominant idea in Islamic, Jewish, and Christian philosophy of the 12th century. The idea that there's nothing higher than reason, even in the upper worlds, meant that understanding what reason is could teach us what mankind and possibly the universe was. Aristotle was the first to develop the idea that human logic was based on a syllogism and that rational thinking was the most sublime of human endeavors. The Kabbalists, as early as Ezra of Gerona and Nachmanides of Gerona in the 13th century, claimed that human thought processes do not actually describe the essence of a human being. Since the I, or the self, is not compatible with thought, the self transcends human perception. And just like a crown on the head, keter in Hebrew, it is a pre-conscious state. So that I think, but I am not my thought. Notions like this we find in Buddhism as well. Edmund Husserl thought that the ego, or the I, was behind human consciousness, an idea which his student Jean-Paul Sartre disagreed with. The Kabbalists go beyond Husserl's claim and claim that the inner self is actually subconscious and not actually known to us. Our self-knowledge is only of our outer perception of self. Therefore, the inner self is called the crown, which is above the head and above awareness. This is a radically different definition of man, where the intelligence is an important feature of the psyche, but not the defining character. What then does the crown represent? The keter. In the writings of both Joseph Gicatilla of 13th century Castile and Moses Cordovero of 16th century Safed, The crown has various connotations. One of them is what we call ratzon in Hebrew, which means will. Gicatilla and Cordovero refer to the crown as the source of will. Now, the idea of will here does not refer to external desires, such as what would I like to eat for lunch, or do I want to go to the university, or do I want to start a business, but to the very basic underlying will, such as the will to survive, the will to live. Gicatilla writes that if one can connect to the substratum of being called the source of will, this connects them to the divine will and even allows them to make changes in the reality which was divinely created. Without trying to understand this latter statement, what we see here is a description of a concept of the ground of being that underlies consciousness, possibly the idea of the eye of consciousness as described by Husserl, but a subconscious version. Every level in the psyche is connected to a divine name, according to Gicatilla and Cordovero. The name connected to the crown is called, in Hebrew, Eheyeh, I will be. In English, this is translated from the book of Exodus 3:14 as, I am that I am. But in Hebrew, it's written in the future tense, I will be that I will be. Therefore, to connect to the crown means to connect to the level of constant being and to the source of becoming simultaneously. Example 2. What is thought, logic, or intuition? As I stated above, Aristotle saw the human being as possessing the logos, the intellect, and therefore established a theory of logic to understand how human logic works. This, of course, assumes that human beings are logical agents, and also that human intelligence is based on logic. The philosophers of the Middle Ages adopted this view as well. This deep belief in logic pushed philosophy forward and laid down the cornerstone for science, but it also laid down a possible faulty premise. Are human beings really logical beings, or do they use logic as a tool, but they themselves are something else? William James, in a 19th century essay, claimed that human beings tend to believe things first, and only afterwards do they look for proofs. That is definitely not a description of a rational being. Carl Jung argued that there are deep-seated archetypes that influence our rational thinking, which differ from culture to culture. In 1964, Cohen and Nagel summarized the old view that logic describes thought, which was the position of Kant. However, they argued that human beings tend to believe ideas that have little connection with logic. Mary Henley pointed out, the psychologist, that human beings do use syllogisms, but more than often their thinking is not completely logical. Logic is more of an ideal. Logic, therefore, is not a description of the thinking process, but rather a tool by which to detect if we made a mistake. This was a trend that was developing in the world of psychology in the first half of the 20th century, and even more so in the post-war era. The sociologist Joseph Ben David wrote of the profound mistrust of modern man in science that appeared around 1970, but what took its place? Howard Gardner wrote a famous book called Frames of Mind to tackle the issue of other types of intelligence aside from logic. This was continued by his student Daniel Goleman in his best-selling book Emotional Intelligence, in which he tried to explain how highly intelligent people sometimes succeed less in life than seemingly low-intelligence students. The German psychologist Gerd Gergerenzer, in his work Gut Feelings, described human intuition as an important factor in human decision-making. And Dan Ariely, the psychologist from Duke University, in his book Predictably Irrational, discussed the psychological factors that force our decision-making. Sheena Iyengar, a professor of business and psychology at Columbia University, in her book The Art of Choosing, wondered if the cultural influences lead us to choose things against our better judgment. It looks like we might need a better definition for a human being than Homo sapiens. The Kabbalists argue that the human psyche parallels three organs of the body: the brain, the heart, and the liver. The brain represents thought, the heart emotions, and the liver represents the lower functions of the body: digestion, movement, growth, and reproduction. At this point, it looks suspiciously close to neo-Aristotelian thinking. However, the Kabbalists go into great detail about the brain. Just as there is a right and left hemisphere, so too there is intuitive thought in the right brain, called wisdom, and analytic thought in the left brain, called intelligence, or in Hebrew, binah. The interface between these two types of thinking bring about knowledge in Hebrew, dat, represented by the cerebellum. The early Kabbalists themselves had trouble with their own traditions, trying to understand that relationship. Most describe this as a process in which the thought process begins with an intuitive hypothesis or intuition, chokhmah, then is analyzed, binah, and the outcome of this being knowledge, dat. This means that all logic begins with the intuitive thought. This is due to the need for intuition to create hypothesis. The book of Zohar refers to this intuitive wisdom, chokhmah, and the analytic knowledge, binah, as an inseparable pair. This means that our decision-making is based on both logic and intuition, which means two things. A, there cannot be logic without intuition, meaning the deductive logic needs an intuitive inductive base to allow it to happen. And B, there cannot be intuition without logic, meaning that even if intuition is quicker than logic, in general, logic is needed to prove the hypothesis for it to feel like we really know it. There are exceptions in which logic will not succeed in doing this. The intuitive perception of wisdom can perceive a priori concepts that analytical intelligence cannot prove, but still knows that is correct, such as axiomatic statements of geometry. In addition, the higher aspect of wisdom comprehends a priori concepts such as morality and free will, both of which cannot be proven by logic. This idea of an a priori nature of morality was discussed by Immanuel Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason. Wisdom thinking, besides being intuitive, can also be symbolic. Example 3, body and soul. Plato described the soul in the image of the rider and the two horses. The rider was the intellect, and the two horses were the spirited or the vital on the one side, and the physical desires on the other. In the Phaedo, Plato speaks of the journey of the soul after death, which was interpreted as the intellectual soul, which must survive the body. The Islamic philosopher Al-Kindi of the 9th century, a Neo-Platonist, saw this notion of eternity of the intellect in the representation of the rider as the intellect, since only the rider is a human figure. Aristotle saw the intellect as being separate from the body. However, he did not see any reason to claim that it survives death. Just as a candle has a wick and a flame, the intellect is like a flame. It is different from the wick and the oil that feeds it, but when the oil and the wick are gone, so too does the flame disappear. This is also how the philosopher Averroes of the 12th century understood Aristotle's idea. Neo-Aristotelians with a religious bent, such as Maimonides, needed therefore to be somewhat eclectic, using Aristotle's understanding of the human soul, but introducing Platonic ideas of the eternity of the soul to suit the rabbinic position. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas attempted to synthesize Aristotelian metaphysics with a Christian idea of the afterlife. René Descartes, in the 17th century, was the first to try to reconnect the soul with the body, claiming that it connects to the body through the pineal gland. The issue of body and soul remained into the modern period as a problem. This eventually was nicknamed the psychophysical problem in the 20th century, which was narrowed down to the question of whether the mind and the body are separate entities or one organic entity. In other words, is the mind, the Greek nous, the sum total of synapses of the brain, or is it a ghost running the machine that we call a brain? This eventually evolved into a debate among cognitive scientists concerning the essence of consciousness. David Chalmers coined the term the hard problem of consciousness in 1995 to describe the areas which seem to transcend the scientific ability to measure the mind. This remains a controversy to this day among cognitive and neuroscientists, with fascinating new literature which is being published annually. There are constant new arguments posed by the reductionists or the materialists on one hand, like philosopher Daniel Dennett, and cognitive scientists like Michael Graziano and Nicholas Humphrey, and the non-reductionist dualists like Thomas Nagel, as well as the panpsychists, which seem closer to the mystical perspective of Buddhism and even the Kabbalah. This dualism seems to be a direct offspring of the psychophysical problem and the body-soul debate of the Middle Ages since the time of Descartes. In the Middle Ages, Jewish philosophers, just like their Christian and Muslim counterparts, accepted this problem as a given. Besides, it seemed to be the only logical answer to the idea that the physical world runs by blind deterministic laws of mechanics, a notion that was strengthened by Isaac Newton's physics. So then how can there be free will? The body-soul duality seemed to offer such an answer. So what do the Kabbalists say on body and soul? Already from the 13th century, the unique position of the Kabbalists regarding body and soul came to the forefront. In a work attributed to a student of Nachmanides of Girona called the Holy Letter, the anonymous author takes Maimonides to task for adopting Aristotle's negative attitude to the sense of touch. The Kabbalists believed that both the body and the soul were holy, since both are God's creation. However, the perspective does not end here. This is only part of this perspective, which I call the sanctity of the body, in that it can perform the functions of the good. The second aspect is that the body reflects the soul and the upper worlds. This idea was highly developed in the 18th century in the writings of the Italian Kabbalist Joseph Irgas. Irgas writes, basing himself on the Zohar, that the body is the clothing of the soul. Just as the clothing must fit the body, so too the body is in complete synchronicity with the soul and reflects it. Therefore, the body is an imprint of the soul on the physical level. The third element of this perspective is that the body and the soul are on a continuum, and therefore, by definition, cannot be at odds with one another. Even if a person struggles with their passions and physical desires, this is not a fault of the body which reflects the soul, rather an abuse of the body. These three elements are quite a novelty and a contrast with the Puritan concepts of the Middle Ages. Interestingly enough, there are some Kabbalists who seem to be unaware of these novel concepts and even argued that the Kabbalists and philosophers said the same thing, but just in a different language. This radical approach, which sees no intrinsic difference between body and soul, but rather a continuum in different dimensions, might offer a new perspective to the psychophysical problem and the understanding of human consciousness. It proposes that, contrary to dualism, it is not an either-or question, but a connection of two levels, crossing a dimensional divide. Therefore, even if Donald Hoffman, in his book, The Case Against Reality, is correct, that reality is an illusion brought to us in a way that evolution thought we could deal with it in order that we could survive, this does not mean that there's no value to the new understanding of the materialists or even the reductionists, since the system was made to be self-supporting from both points of view. Due to the time, I want to summarize. What does all this teach us? The Kabbalistic paradigms are models that can be useful today, since they seem to represent directions in which scientists are already moving. Number one, that man is not just rational thought, but might have an inner self. Number two, that human thought is not only logical thinking, but there may be multiple types of thinking ranging from intuitive to logical. Three, that the mind-body model might not be material or dualistic, but a continuum. Four, that this continuum can be identified in the area of cosmogony and the universe, going from one state or one dimension to another, rather than creation ex nihilo. I didn't talk about this, but in the article that will come out, I will describe this. Five, as far as consciousness and the mind, since there is not a dualism, there is a value both to the reductionist approach and the panpsychic approach, despite being opposites. They represent the two perspectives of nature and mankind. And finally, the mind-body relationship is also, it's not a dualism, but a continuum, as I said, in which both the material and non-material aspects are a full system and can be analyzed by both perspectives. And there's much more to say about this. Thank you for listening. And I wish everybody good health and peace.